for everything. I just hope I've got enough time to actually cover what I've got in my talk. Because Brother David last week very much introduced Ecclesiastes in terms of who wrote it and set the scene. And so we'd like to include within the talk just a précis of chapters 1 and 2, so we get the continuity as we lead into chapters 3 and 4. But just to recap for those that weren't here last week, Ecclesiastes is very much about vanity, as I'm sure we all know, the futile emptiness of trying to be happy apart from God. And the preacher that, as Brother David showed last week, is likely to be Solomon, the wisest, richest, most influential king in Israel's history, looks at life under the sun and from the human perspective declares it all to be empty. Power, popularity, prestige, pleasure, nothing can fill the God-created void in man's life but God himself. And so he goes on to exclaim, eat, drink, rejoice, do good, live joyfully, fear God and keep his commandments. Skepticism and despair melt away when life is viewed as a daily gift from God. Well, it was probably written late in Solomon's life, around 935 BC. And if this is so, the great glory that Solomon ushered in early in his reign was already beginning to fade, and the division of Israel into two kingdoms would soon take place. And Jewish tradition asserts that Solomon wrote Song of Solomon in his youthful years, Proverbs in his middle years, and Ecclesiastes in his later years, which makes a lot of sense. And the book may be expressing his regret for his folly and his wasted time due to carnality and idolatry. Ecclesiastes convincingly portrays the emptiness and perplexity of life without a relationship with the Lord. Each person has eternity in his heart, and only Christ can provide ultimate satisfaction, joy and wisdom. And man's highest good is found in the one shepherd who offers abundant life. And the bottom line exhortation is, let's not be caught chasing after the wind. However tangible that wind may appear, it will still cause grief and vexation of spirit. It will lead us earthward to pursue the things under the sun. Rather, we should always look Godward and pray diligently for spiritual guidance and wisdom. And so we might begin by reflecting upon how many common phrases, proverbs and idioms draw upon the circular nature of existence, whether it be going round in circles, a virtuous or vicious cycle, or things being swings and roundabouts. What these sayings capture is the sense of frustration and vanity associated with being human, continually returning back to where we first began. It's then appropriate that the book should commence with the idea of the circle of life immediately after the opening prologue. And so we see from this précis the sections of chapters 1 and 2, the prologue, the continuous circuit of human generations and cycles. There's no solution to the human dilemma in the world's wisdom. The experiment to find lasting satisfaction in human achievements. He then states death is the great leveller and nullifies those human achievements. And then the human perspective on God's blessings. And so why we would study those first two chapters. So chapter 1 is to consider the author, the theme and underlying question of the book, to note the preacher's observations about the cycles of life and his conclusions regarding the value of human wisdom. In chapter 2, to note the degree to which the preacher sought for meaning in life under the sun. To consider his estimation of mirth, pleasure, wine, wisdom, folly and wealth in providing purpose for living. And to appreciate his conclusion for what is best in life and the one who makes it possible, that then leads us into chapters 3 and 4. And so Ecclesiastes serves a purpose like Job, but subtly different. So lessons from a quest, effectively. So Job illustrates what God's way is the right way to live, no matter what happens during our lives. And it uses suffering as the means to develop this issue. Ecclesiastes helps us to realise that true happiness and satisfaction can only come when we fear God and keep his commandments and have the faith to trust whatever God brings into our lives. So it deals with broader issues than that of Job. And of course, both books were very useful for our Lord and Master. But why was Solomon so frustrated? Well, he set out to find the purpose of life in this world. He witnessed that death comes to all and brings everyone to the same point, whether we are good or bad. And this seemed unfair to Solomon. And it may have been a reaction to some of the proverbs that he wrote. He came to realise that from a human perspective, this life may be unfair because God uses unfairness to test us. He also realised that all the wisdom we might have can't empower us to understand the work of God in our lives. So Solomon ultimately had to learn to trust in God, as we all do. And we refer specifically to the human achievements experiment that Brother David also talked about last week, where we see in verse 1 of chapter 2, I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee, or put to the test, with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity. So we have the test of pleasure, the test of sensual indulgence, the test of creative work, the test of administration, and of course the test of wealth. Does wisdom bring profit, we read in verses 12 to 18 of chapter 1. And Solomon's first gift was wisdom, and he tried to use this wisdom to understand and analyse life. He sees all the work that God has given us to do as a grievous task by which we may be exercised or, importantly, humbled. And he becomes frustrated that he can't make the crooked straight, but then learns it's because God makes it that way, as is referenced later on in Ecclesiastes. And so, as we know, he was tested with hard work and great possessions. So he built houses, he planted vineyards, gardens and orchards with irrigations. And he was a busy man. If we look at the records, 1 Kings 5, 180,000 men, labour force for his building projects, 30,000 Jews and 150,000 Gentiles. He spent much of his time in building projects, 7 years building the temple, 13 years building his house, built a house for Pharaoh's daughter, repaired the Millo Tower and the wall of Jerusalem, etc. And Solomon had hoped in all this, these projects would last for hundreds of years. And he got male and female servants. He bred huge herds and flocks. He gathered silver and gold and king's treasures. He acquired male and female singers and many concubines. He became great and excelled beyond all kings in Jerusalem before him. He tried everything. It was all vanity and grasping for wind and didn't bring satisfaction. And so he concludes from all that, all the tests that he went through, it's best to eat and drink and enjoy what good there is in one's labour. He realised, however, that the ability to truly enjoy life is a gift from God. He saw that God gives wisdom, knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. To the sinner, God might give the ability to gather and collect great wealth, but it eventually winds up in the hands of him who is good before God. And thus much labour without God's blessing is truly vanity and grasping for the wind, as chapter 2 concludes. And so then we move on to chapters 3 to 6. Obviously, next week we're considering 5 to 6, I believe. And we suspect that this reference to man and the beast, not many people would take too kindly to being described as a beast, as we read in these chapters. And in fact, when we think about it, more than a few human insults are centred around the idea of being like one of the beasts of the earth. However, a part of elevating our minds to spiritual things and the wisdom that comes from above is to first recognise our natural and pitiable state. And so it is that King Solomon, the preacher, uses this metaphor a number of times in Ecclesiastes, particularly in chapter 3, as he drives home the point that left to himself, man also wades through the mud under the yoke of bondage to his natural fate, rather like the labouring oxen that we see in the picture there. And so when we consider the key sections we've got here, I won't go through them all. Obviously, Brother Stuart will have the slides if you want to go through them in detail. When we consider the key sections, the message of the book is as stark as it is straightforward. There is, however, a solution to the otherwise intractable human problem, as sections of the narrative begin to uncover. This is that we must submit to God's timescales in chapter 3, worship God in the way that he demands, and recognise that all things that we have are the gift of God, and both these latter points are considered in chapter 5. And as such, there's a great deal of exhortation that we can take from our study of particularly this part of this instructive book. So we move on then to chapters 3 and 4, and in the first two chapters, although we didn't study it in any great detail, the preacher described the extent of his search for the purpose of life under the sun. In this chapter and the three to follow, he shares observations that he gleaned during the course of his search. So chapter 3 opens with one of the most familiar sections of the book, as we've just read together, and one which even some non-churchgoers may be able to at least partially recite. And I won't read it all again because we've just read it at the start of our meeting. But it's worth pointing out that at the start of that, you see the verse, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven." And it's worth commenting on the two words, season and time. And the first of these is the Hebrew zuman, and means appointed occasion. It's only found 4 times in the Old Testament, and the other reference is in Esther, chapter 9, verse 27, where it talks about ordaining the Feast of Purim. So an appointed occasion. Whereas time, as we see there, is from the much more frequently found word eth, appearing 295 times, and mostly as time. And then, as we've seen, there follows an intricate pattern of 14 couplets, which starts and ends with a positive statement, a time to be born and a time of peace, as we've read. And the pattern between these points is an intriguing one, as we found out by studying this. The flow of the 14 couplets is as follows, as we can see. There's positives and negatives all the way through these verses, respectively, one after the other, through those verses. And we wonder why there is this intricate arrangement. We believe it's there for emphasis, with some internal symmetries. But interestingly, and this is to me the interesting point, there are exactly the same number of positives as there are negatives. And if you add up 14 positives and 14 negatives, you get to 0, which ultimately sums up natural life. So we think there is a reason from the way it's been worded and the symmetry there. But is it too simplistic? Is it too simplistic to suggest that some of the times are positive, as we've just said, and some of them are negative, to be born or to die? Well, this is perhaps the case behind the next section in this chapter that describes that he hath made everything beautiful in his time. Verse 11, as we've read. And so when we think about it, there is an appropriate time or an appointed occasion for everything. As it starts the chapter, an appointed occasion, that word zuman. And depending on the circumstances or context, everything in the list of verses 1 to 8 can be viewed as positive or negative. So what we might ask is, what is the problem for humankind? Well, it is that we do not naturally know when the appropriate time is, do we? We are incapable of seeing the bigger picture. We see this implied in the New English translation of verse 11. God has made everything fit beautifully in its appropriate time, but he has also placed ignorance in the human heart so that people cannot discover what God has ordained from the beginning to the end of their lives. And then we'd like to just look at a few examples, and this is the first of the examples, where faithful of old have not necessarily waited for God to act. And of course, Abraham and Sarah didn't know the right time, and they decided to take action through Hagar, as we know. But of course, God knew the time, and it was in his purpose to make them wait, so long as it was clear that this child was a blessing from God, with them being old age, and provided by God, and of God. And so his plan is not ours. But how often do we jump ahead, thinking we know best? And so verses 9 to 15, we'll read that because we didn't read all of that. What profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboureth? I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labour. It is the gift of God. I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. That which hath been is now, and that which is to be hath already been, and God requireth that which is past. And so we've got some summary statements on the slide there. That verse 9 is getting across what profit does a worker get from all his work. Again, it's all coming back to this same vanity and vexation. And men are occupied with work because God intended it that way, to humble us, as is the Young's literal translation in verse 10. Not grievous. And Solomon was beginning to see the importance of God's purpose in his life. God made everything beautiful in its time, in harmony with all God's work. And he refers to this word eternity. What about this phrase about setting the world in heart? And human beings can unquestionably sense eternity as world, as it's translated as world in New King James Version, NIV and the ESV, having seen God's physical creation. However, presently time is the great restrictor. And the hope, however, is that God will replace the times of ignorance with righteous judgment, as the next section considers. And so, as we see in Psalms 127, unless the Lord does it, they labour in vain who work. And so we go on through those verses. And the lessons are there for us. I think this is the most important part of these chapters. There's so much exhortation to appreciate what God does for us and what God has given us, to appreciate our food, our clothing and our houses. And we see now that Solomon's talking about I know, and he's got that confidence now to talk about it. He's seen it from his life and can exhort to us. Eat, drink and enjoy the results of your labour. It's God's gift to you. And whatever God does is forever. He's working for our eternal good, not temporary. And this should cause us to fear him and learn to live by faith in God. As we know, God knows the end from the beginning, but he requires an account of our past. And so, as we also know, there will be a judgment day. And so there must be something beyond the time of reward. Well, we talked about Abraham and Sarah, who had to wait till it was humanly impossible for them to have a child. And there's other examples, aren't there? Isaac and Rebekah waited 20 years for God to cause Isaac to be born. Job waited for God to finally send Elihu and speak to Job himself. David ran from Saul for years as he waited for God to make him king. Jacob waited years for God to change his children into spiritual sons of God. Joseph waited for over 20 years for God to reunite him with his family and his dreams to be fulfilled. And of course Moses, Caleb and Joshua waited 40 years for God to lead Israel into the promised land. And Abigail patiently waited years for God to remove Nabal and grant her a godly husband. So we've got so many examples, haven't we, in Scripture, of waiting for God's timetable and not looking to ourselves. The final section of chapter 3 contains the first mention of God's judgment in the book so far, drawing particularly on the theme we highlighted in the middle of this section, the beasts of the earth. And we'll look at those verses 17. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, that they might see that they themselves are beasts. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts, even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. All go unto one place, all are of the dust, and all are turned to dust again. Well, the Bible first introduces to death, doesn't as we know, in Genesis 3, and it's significant that there are a number of parallels between the account of the fall of man recorded there and the book of Ecclesiastes, as we can see on the screen, and we'll just go through some of them. Indeed, the statement of Ecclesiastes 12, verse 7, considers, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. So this is a reversal of the process by which God formed man and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And it's a deliberate echo of God's condemnation in verse 19 there. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. We saw the same echo in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 20. It's not just the death sentence, however, which echoes Genesis. The preacher concludes in chapter 7 verse 29, again on the screen. Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. And this is the picture that the first section of Genesis illustrates. God's good and upright creation perverts itself through sin, first in the garden and then again and again as the first part of Genesis unfolds. It was because of Adam and Eve's sins that God placed creation under a curse. Romans, as we shall see later, describes the whole creation of groaning and travailing in pain together as a consequence of this. And Ecclesiastes describes that very situation. Its abundant use of the key terms labour, toil, travail and work reminds us of the sentence that God placed on man, that in the sweat of his face he was to eat bread till he returned to the dust again. And so reading Ecclesiastes in the light of Genesis 3 is a very fruitful and helpful thing to do. The ground was cursed for Adam's sake, and in sorrow he was to eat of it all the days of his life, as we see in verse 17 there. And one could not have a more poignant expansion of this sorry state of affairs than what we find in Ecclesiastes. Furthermore, the preacher stresses that it was God's deliberate action to subject man to this vain existence. And it's no accident that the world is this way. It all came about and was ordained by God because of man's foolishness and rebellion. I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 10. Note what the verse says. God has given this to man. Enduring the futile existence is the role God has given to humanity. He has decreed that there should be no profit in our daily toil of working to feed ourselves. In a matter of a few hours we grow hungry again, and so enter another circuit of working to feed ourselves, and so on. Ad infinitum, what profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboureth? Well, it's all a bit depressing, isn't it? Vain things the preacher describes can be seen to arise as a result of our own folly. Essentially, Ecclesiastes is fleshing out the curses recorded in Genesis of the bondage to which man was to be subjected because of his sin. However, as we know, the New Testament speaks on a much brighter note. So Ecclesiastes reaches right back to the very earliest parts of the Bible, the creation account and the record of the fall and its punishment. But Ecclesiastes points forward too, for its language is picked up in a number of places in the New Testament to describe a time when these curses will ultimately be removed. And we've got the two passages up there. And the first one's to Romans 8. And here Paul describes how God has subjected the creation to vanity. The very use of the word in Romans 8 takes us back to Ecclesiastes, doesn't it? The Greek word used in Romans 8 is the same word used repeatedly for vanity in the Septuagint translation of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes demonstrates the way in which the creation has been subjected to vanity by God, as we have seen, and Paul also stresses that it is God who has done this subjecting. Paul goes on to say, however, that the creation will be delivered from this bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body, as we've got on the screen there. Or the bondage to which we are now subject will be transformed into liberty when our Lord returns to establish God's kingdom. Then there will be no more groaning and travailing, no more pain and suffering, all of which were key themes in the writings of the preacher. The curse depicted so powerfully in Ecclesiastes is to be removed. And then the second passage in 1 Corinthians, again familiar words. And it's the last of these verses which deliberately echoes the language of Ecclesiastes. Paul encourages us to be steadfast, immovable, to abound in the work of the Lord. Why should we do this? Why should we be engaged in the work of the Lord? Because our labour is not in vain in the Lord. And so we have a complete contrast, don't we, to Ecclesiastes. Whereas labour in Ecclesiastes is ultimately of no profit and is rewarded only with death, work in the Lord is entirely different. Our labour for him is not in vain in any sense, because it will lead to our redemption from the bondage of sin and death, to the reversal of the pessimistic worldview which the preacher was forced to portray when he considered life under the sun. And there are two types of work, two levels of living, with two very different rewards: work for this world and work for the Lord. In this way, the very pessimism of Ecclesiastes enshrines both the past and the future. On the one hand, the Old Testament allusions back to Genesis remind us that we are locked in an order of things inaugurated by God because of sin, the futile existence of endless work and vain pleasure. Ecclesiastes describes the fact that we believe about sin and death and about the way the world is at present, meaningless without God. But on the other hand, the language of Ecclesiastes as taken up in the New Testament points to a kind of work and a level of existence in serving God now, which has abundant purpose and abundant satisfaction, and which through God's grace will usher in a new order, when the bondage of corruption will finally be taken away. And so in summary, we see that there are sometimes wicked judgments made, reference in verse 16, but ultimately God has set a time to eventually judge. And God uses this delay to test us. And it appears that we now have lives like animals. We live for a while and then we die. And both man and animals are of the dust and return to the dust. And so we're exhorted to rejoice and be thankful for God's gifts now, for we know for sure what will happen after death. And so God is testing us now to see if we really want to live like him and if we will trust him forever. I had got some comments on this unusual verse, chapter 3, verse 21, which appears to be a rhetorical way of describing it. And I've got some words from another brother, which I wouldn't mind sharing with you. And he writes, because it could mislead a believer in the way it's written, who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth. So when we're preaching the truth, we may get questioned on this verse. And this brother writes, the preacher here states that with respect to death, we are no better than the animals. We share the same fate as they do. To this is appended, however, a verse which reads rather awkwardly in the King James Version, suggesting that in contradiction to what has just been said, there may be a distinction between the spirit of man and beast, one going up and the other going down. And so we might ask, how should we respond? And he writes, there is no doubt whatsoever that this passage cannot be read as a factual statement about what happens to the spirits of man and beast. The Hebrew does not permit such a reading. Rather, the verse is a rhetorical question, the preacher engaging in polemic against a view he rejects. The verse takes the form of a question best understood in the rhetorical sense. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of a beast downwards to the earth? It seems most likely the preacher is alluding to the then current beliefs or superstitions concerning the spirits of men and beasts. Some in the ancient world did suggest a distinction between the two, just as they do today, claiming men have one fate and animals another. But the preacher, who has just asserted that man and beast share an identical fate, would be contradicting himself if he was supporting this view. Instead, he's showing that it is impossible to make a distinction between the fates of man and beast. He is in effect saying, some people might say that the spirit of man is different to an animal, but how are you going to prove that this is true? Where is your evidence going to come from? Who knows? Nobody. It's just someone's unverifiable idea. The verse is thus almost an exclamation. The preacher does not explicitly come out and say that such a view is wrong, although he implies it by his statements in verses 19 and 20, but rather he pours scorn on it, because the view is such a hypothetical and unprovable position to take. It's a view which has no basis in observable fact, quite the opposite when contrasted with his own realism. True, all this may be rather difficult to explain to a believer in the immortal soul, but we must at least be assured that our position is a correct understanding of the original, which theirs is not. The passage does not make sense in its context if taken in any other way. I apologise, that's a bit wordy, but that's one brother's answer to that verse. And so when we come on to chapter 4, and the objectives in studying Ecclesiastes chapter 4 is to reflect upon the preacher's observations gleaned from his search for the purpose of life under the sun. It's to consider the vanity of skillful work, isolation and popularity, and finally appreciate the value of friendship and working together. So that's a précis of this chapter 4. And we start off chapter 4, the first 3 verses. We read, So I returned and considered all the oppressions as were under the sun, and behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead, more than the living which are yet alive. Yet better is he than both they which have not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. And so again the writer employs the device of irony when he opens chapter 4, noting that neither the oppressed nor oppressors find comfort in this life. We can compare that to James chapter 5 verses 1 to 6. After all, without God they both live a life without meaning. And we've just read that in verse 1. And twice in chapter 4 we have the phrase I return, the first being in verse 1. And what's been emphasised is that the preacher keeps coming back to the human problem and looking at it from different perspectives. Interestingly, chapter 4, along with chapter 10, contains no mention of God whatsoever. We believe it's because it's accentuating the humanistic view of things. And ultimately, this opening section of the chapter concludes, Wherefore I praised the dead, which are already dead, more than the living, which are yet alive. It's a cruel reality of the human experience that it is only death that we are freed from evil. those not yet born, as we read in verse 3, being even better, having never seen evil, with the most lamentable position being occupied by those alive who are currently experiencing evil. And so we see on the slide a summary. Many people are oppressed by people who have power, and these oppressed people have no comforters, no one to help them. And some oppressed people may be even better off dead, as it says. Better is he who never existed and didn't have to see and experience this evil work. And this is similar to many other references in Job, in Jeremiah, and also in Matthew. So God uses these situations to test his people, to ultimately form that trust. The remainder of chapter 4 takes different angles on a single subject, on ultimately human labour. And we can break it down into 4 sections. So verses 4 to 6, we will read it. I'm trying to manage time here. And that wasn't meant to be a pun. Verses 4 to 6, for he cometh in with vanity, and departeth in darkness, and his name shall be covered with darkness. Sorry, I'm in the wrong chapter. Chapter 4, verse 4. Again I considered all travail and every right work, that for this man is envied of his neighbour. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit. The fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. Better is an handful with quietness than both the hands of full with travail and vexation of spirit. So ultimately, verses 4 to 6 talks about this key point of labour can be envied. I don't know, yes, you can probably see that quite well on the screen there. Much of human labour is driven by what's known as an envy cycle. So starting at the top, I envy you, I envy what you've got. So as a result, I compete, beat the Joneses. I then might succeed, and so then you envy me, and you compete with me, and then you succeed. And so it goes round and round again. It's this same cycle, a number of these cycles, all the way through Ecclesiastes. However, in contrast to that, we've read in verse 5, to do nothing, so to not do any work at all, would require someone to eat their own flesh, because we wouldn't be able to provide and sustain ourselves. And so the balance point is to be content with our lot. Verse 6, better is an handful with quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. And then we go on to verses 7 and 8. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, and there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet there is no end of all his labour. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Neither saith he, for whom do I labour, and bereave my soul of good? This is also vanity. Yea, it is a sore travail. So again, a negative point. Labour can be endless. If there's no heir, no sibling, and no end to the labour, then ultimately, for whom is all this effort being expended? What's the point if there is no heir, no sibling, and no end to this labour? I mean, it actually starts to question. It certainly made me question some of my decisions and spending too much time at work, having gone through all of this. It's certainly got a tremendous amount of exhortation for us all. And then we go on to verses 9 to 12. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labour. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, if 2 lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, 2 shall withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And so this is very much a positive section, isn't it? That labour can be shared. And the point here is that in all cases, two people working together, or a team of people, is better than 1. For what reason? As we've read, well, 2 can reap more, can help if one falls, can keep warm, and fend off an assailant or an enemy. And then we come back to some more negativity in verses 13 to 16. Better is a poor and a wise child than an old and a foolish king, who will no more be admonished. For out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. I considered all the living which walk under the sun, with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and vexation of spirit. And so the end is it's very much negative again, and this part is considering the use of the figure of a king. And what's described? Well, it's another cycle of vanity. So we've got an old rich king, and we've got a poor wise prisoner. In verse 14, for out of prison he cometh to reign, where also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. So another succeeds and replaces this old rich king. So it's this similar cycle of life. So just to summarise again these slides, verses 4 to 8, and take some exhortation away once more for ourselves. Verse 4, some people are so fixed, aren't they? And that envious cycle summarises that. So fixed on outdoing their neighbour that they oppress themselves to be the best. As that little plaque says, he who dies with the most toys wins. And then there's the other extreme, the fool who doesn't work at all and ruins himself in that way. And then we're exhorted much better to have a little with peace than lots with too much stress, as we could also refer to in Proverbs 23. And some people work endlessly, don't they, but are never satisfied and don't take the time to enjoy what God gives us. And so we're exhorted in Timothy, aren't we, that godliness with contentment is great gain. You gain a lot when you lead a godly life, but you must be happy with what you have. As we've just seen, teamwork is better than trying to be the best. Two are better than one. They help each other when troubles arise. They keep each other warm. They defend each other from those who would harm us. And three is even better than two, or multiple numbers. And so those who go it alone have no one to help when they need it. And of course we think about our ecclesia here. We think about our families and how important it is for us to work together, to support each other, to lift up the feeble knee, so that we aren't left alone, that we're not on our own, and that two are better than one. And so in conclusion, it's interesting going back to the start of our talk and looking at those verses, but removing all of the negative points, and how fascinating it then reads of a picture of the kingdom when there will be a right time for everything, a time to be born, a time to plant, a time to heal and a time to build up, a time to laugh and a time to dance, a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, a time to get, a time to keep, a time to sow, a time to speak, a time to love, and a time of peace. How amazing that sounds when you take away all those other points. And of course 14 positives equals 0 negatives. So all of that natural life disappears, and we're left with a much healthier life and a much more peaceful and glorious time that we all look and long for. Thank you.